Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here. My name's Peter Clark. I'm Head of Chemistry and Industrial Biotech at Innovate UK Business Connect. So we are part of the Innovate UK system that's supporting business-led innovation here in the UK. My role at Innovate UK Business Connect really is split down into two key activities. So at any one point in time, we're using our knowledge and network to connect innovators to funding opportunities that exist today. That's what we're doing, point one. What we're doing in the second stage, we're doing this 1 and 2 concurrently, is we're helping to work with government, particularly Innovate UK, to help inform what we should be funding in the future. So I've been asked to come today to talk a little bit about the sustainable carbon ambition for the UK chemicals industry, a report we recently launched, and that's going to play into the whole feedstocks agenda, so the start of that supply chain that we're going to be talking about today. I'm also going to provide some thoughts, provocative thoughts, around that will hopefully stimulate conversation around the sort of research and innovation funding that we're going to need if we're going to tackle this meaty problem. So I think if anyone in this room is not clear on the value of chemicals to the value that chemicals bring to our lives, then I think we've got a serious problem. I think we all know the value that chemicals bring. But I love this diagram. It's from the Royal Society that just helps articulate that you can't get away from chemicals. We interact with them every day of our lives. Those of you that aren't from industry might not recognize actually the size of the chemicals industry that we have here in the UK. So it is a buoyant sector. There's more than 4,000 businesses that are employing people. So more than 150,000 jobs are created directly through the chemicals industry, and then another 500,000 are supported in downstream sectors. This is an important sector for the UK. It's also a complex sector. We can think about breaking it down in terms of its subsectors here. So this starts to give you a sense of the different components of the chemical sector and the role it plays in creating revenue and employment in the UK. In the context of net zero, the chemicals industry really is unique in terms of its situation as a foundation industry. And it's unique, Andrew's already mentioned it, it's unique because it uses fossil resources not just not just as an energy vector, but as a feedstock. And that does make it unique. It means it's a unique challenge for us when we think about the net zero transition. Also, we talked about complexity earlier. Wow. Sure, this is absolutely a complex problem. What we've had for the last 70 years is we've really enjoyed access to this beautiful fossil resource that's allowed us to create these complex value chains. It's allowed us to create huge economies of scale. We see that in China, in the US, in Europe, in Saudi Arabia. We're able to piggyback off these low-cost feedstocks and create these value chains. And it's before these products reach us, they go through multiple transformations, which means multiple companies having to touch these chemicals, convert them before they end up in a product that we interact with in every day of our lives. So we at Innovate UK wanted to ask ourselves, so given that complexity, given the importance of the sector, what does it look like in 2050 as we transition to a net zero future? And we started asking ourselves that question, but also one question, of course, leads to many others. What are the strategic innovation activities that we need to support going forward? How does the UK compare with other countries? We couldn't answer those questions clearly, which is why we commissioned the Sustainable Carbon for the UK Chemicals Industry Ambition Study. Now, that's a 5-month study. We recently released a report just a couple of weeks ago. That study was commissioned by Innovate UK, but it was conducted by expert consultants, one of which is Jen van der Hoven, who you're going to hear from next, who represents Frey Consulting. But she was partnered with NNFCC and Perspective Economics. So they're the ones that have done this fantastic piece of work. And it's a pleasure to be here today to share with you some of the key insights from that report. Okay, so stepping back, let's have a think about the chemical sector. What are its options to transition to a net zero future? So we've already had this mentioned. A lot of the focus to date has been on Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. How do we decarbonize our intensive industry sectors? And that's this purple area here too, that I highlight here. So we've actually seen lots of investment go in already through government and industry investment into decarbonising processing. We need more, but I think we can look towards investments in CCS, renewable energy. That's great. What I'm going to talk about today is this bit at the top, is how do we look at defossilizing the chemical sector? How do we look at moving to non-fossil sustainable resources to produce the chemicals and materials that we need in order to meet the demand for low carbon products into the future? I'm not going to talk too much about reducing demand, but it is important. So really want to acknowledge that it starts with trying to find ways to reduce demand. I won't go into this too much. I know the great work that the RSC team have done about thinking about this as a systems approach. It's really important to consider what happens to chemicals at the end of their life. I'll mainly be focusing on the feedstock agenda today, but just to recognise that there is also carbon emissions associated with end of life that we must also consider as part of this transition. Okay, so I now just want to have a look at feedstock types. So it really boils down to just 4 feedstocks that we have to work with. It's a bit more complicated than that, but let's just work with 4. So really, we have virgin fossil carbon. Around 90% of organic chemicals today are made from virgin fossil carbon via the value chains that I showed you earlier. We then have 3 other main options. Biomass, and Jen will talk more about the different types of biomass that are available to us. Then there's recycled carbon. So that is carbon that was originally derived from fossil feedstocks, but we're able to give it a second life, maybe a third life, by eventually chemically recycling it. And just to be clear, chemical recycling is the last option. We want to keep carbon in its primary use for as long as possible. But once it eventually reaches the end of its valuable use, we can look at chemically recycling it. Then there's CO2. CO2 is pretty abundant. CO2 is part of the problem, right? It's why we talk about net zero. We can get it via 2 mechanisms. We can get it through direct air capture, or we can get it through capturing point source emissions. These are our only options when we think about producing chemicals. The consulting team have done a lot of work to look at the factors that affect the availability of these different forms of carbon. And unfortunately, as with everything in life, it's complicated. There are lots of reasons why we may not be able to get access to these feedstocks that we want in the chemical sector. There's loads of competing factors, and Jen and the team have mapped that out very clearly in the report, and I'll come back to that also later. Now I want to share with you, I realise I'm taking you on a bit of a roller coaster ride here, so roller coasters may be a bit strong, but now I want to tell you about some of the stakeholder feedback that we've gathered during this report, because actually we interviewed around 100 organisations. We engaged with more than 250 individuals from the sector. Many of you will have participated. So I want to share with you some of the high-level feedback. What did the community say about this ambition? 98% of them agreed that we absolutely need to transition away from using fossil resources. No idea who the 2% were that disagreed. But 100% absolutely agreed that until fossil resources are no longer subsidised, it's going to make it difficult for this to be commercially viable. This point at the bottom is really important. We need more work here. We're talking a lot about carbon, but when we move and transition to these low carbon feedstocks, we are going to need loads of hydrogen. And I say loads because we don't have the right numbers yet around how much hydrogen we're going to need. But low carbon hydrogen is so important for decarbonisation in other sectors. We are going to need to fight for our right to have access to that hydrogen and use it not just as an energy vector, but as a vector to produce chemicals. And the same goes with renewable energy. As part of this transition, we are going to need lots of renewable energy. As a bit of a segue, one of the things we asked the consultants was to provide us with some numbers and data to help articulate the scale of the challenge that we are under. Hopefully not to make us fearful, but to give us some numbers to work with. So as part of the study that they did, they looked at how much hydrogen and investment we would need to produce 1 million tonnes of light olefins via green methanol. And to put that into context, and Jen can hopefully correct me if I'm wrong later, I think today we produce is either 2.2 or 2.5 million tonnes of ethylene today in the UK, so just as a bit of context. But to produce 1 million tonnes of light olefins per year, we would need 5 gigawatts, we'd need 10 gigawatts of renewable energy, 5 gigawatts from an electrolyser, totaling £12 billion in investment. So to start from scratch, this is a big number. I think it also points towards possibly us needing to look at really bringing down the cost of hydrogen, because this is a really large number. But it's useful to at least have some numbers we can start to talk about in terms of the scale of this challenge. There are other important pieces of feedback. I think when we look at new building blocks for the future, ethylene and methanol are seen as quite important building blocks, but there are a range of chemicals in the report that we highlight that the community have said we need to start scaling up here in the UK. I think this point on the right is really important. We are in a room of the converted. We love chemicals. We understand the value they bring. How do we communicate that message outside of this room? How do we communicate it to our families and get them engaged? Because at the end of the day, we're competing with other sectors for investment and a net zero future. Very quickly, what were some of the main challenges that the chemicals industry said in preventing this growth? There are a lot. If I just highlight the top 4, cost profitability, uncertainty around feedstock price, regulatory barriers, and access to R&D funding, which I'm going to come on to next. But where did we land? I want to tell you, where did we land with the stakeholder ambition? So Jen and the team took a number of scenarios, future scenarios, to our community and asked them to deliberate on what was the most likely stakeholder ambition scenario. And they came up with this ambition that by 2050, we'll actually be sourcing 80% of our carbon requirements from non-virgin sustainable sources. That's quite a leap from where we are today. It's also not, interestingly, saying that we're going to be going 100% fossil-free by 2050, and I think that's an important point. So this is the ambition. This is a Sankey diagram showing how this might evolve over time, and what it's saying is that by 2050 we expect around 30% of our chemicals to be derived from biomass, 30% from recycled carbon, 20% still from virgin fossil, and 20% from CO2. This will be wrong, okay? It will, but the future is in our hands, and now we have something to compare it to and look at. When we look at, as I said, we asked the consultants to give us some numbers that we can at least deliberate on whether they're realistic or not. So we asked them to look at how much carbon we're going to need for this transition. And if you look at biomass, it's saying that by 2050, we will need to be using 3.4 million tonnes of biomass. That's 24% of the available biomass that we have in the UK. Recycled carbon, different challenge. Actually, we're saying that if we want to get to 30%, we're going to need to be importing that carbon. CO2, again, really different challenge. There's no shortage of CO2. The challenge is capturing it. And yes, there's no beating thermodynamics. We all know that in this room. There will be a cost penalty if we want to use CO2, absolutely. But it's readily available either via direct air capture or from point sources. And we know there's loads of interdependencies that are going to affect this future. But what this also points to is how much we really need to, from where we are today versus where we're going to need to go in the future, we really need to start making headway in accelerating a scale up of these different carbon sources. In part 2, I just want to talk about what needs to happen to accelerate this transition. The report talks about a 4-pronged approach. Approach 1, we cannot switch off the fossil tap. And in fact, the scenario says it's not going to go away anytime quick. We've got loads of skilled people. We still do have a really vibrant chemical sector. We're going to need to look and see about how we protect the current assets that we have. They have a long lifetime. How do we ensure that they remain internationally competitive whilst minimizing their impact on the environment? But we must also be doing 2, 3, and 4. We must be looking strategically at where we invest in biomass to chemicals, chemical recycling as part of a move to a circular economy, and where does it make sense to invest in CCU. That will all be enabled by policy. Jen's going to talk a bit more about policy as well, but the challenge we have in the UK is no one's really looking after our carbon as a whole. We have policies that are looking at perhaps how do we use carbon for energy, or how do we use carbon for transport fuels? Who's looking at how we use carbon for chemicals and materials? No one really at the moment. There's certainly a need for collaboration and investment. We've heard that from the previous speakers, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. So how do we help the UK-based chemical companies secure more investment? I will share with you some of the insights from the report. So we asked the team to look at investment. How does the UK compare with other countries, other countries with strong chemical sector? Interestingly, when they counted up the number of innovative chemical sector companies who are seeking investment, GB comes up with a high number of companies. We've got 50. But what was interesting, the analysis showed, and I think this is right, that on average, the average fundraise from a chemical company in the UK is 14 times less than that of Germany. So what they're saying is we're securing, in total, certainly, we're securing less investment in the UK, in UK innovative chemical companies than some of our counterparts elsewhere in the world. So we talk about R&D and innovation, but in the end, we need it to land in investments in the UK. What else did our stakeholders say they need in terms of innovation funding? I'm going to rattle through this quite quickly. They said we need better access to scale-up facilities and expert knowledge. We need affordable UK pilot and demonstration facilities. We need long-term access to finance. That's seen as a big barrier. So we've got some things that get stuck at TRL 3 and 4. How do we get them out the valley of death? How do we support them all the way through to commercialization? So I realise I haven't given you answers on exactly what's needed. I do want to leave you now just with a few case studies. So we're not starting from scratch here, right? This is a big challenge, but I want to give you 3 case studies. So we've got an investment in Mura Technology. This was investment made via Innovate UK. This is a plant that's doing chemical recycling in the UK. It's putting a plant up in Teesside. I think they're building in Q4 this year. It's really exciting, a chemical recycling technology. We can look at the FlutoChem project, another project that's been funded by Innovate UK. What I really, really like about this, we talk about collaboration. This is bringing all of the partners together in that new value chain that needs to, the companies that need to come together when we think about taking CO2 from a point source and putting it into a chemical putting it into a product that we use every day, a surfactant. We have everyone in the value chain involved in this project. I think we're going to need more projects like that. Finally, I haven't mentioned biomass. It would be, so I wanted to give a shout out to Hollyfirm, which are a company who I think are a real trailblazer. And that, how do we replicate Hollyfirm? How do we support more companies like Hollyfirm? Very quickly, it would be remiss of me in my role at Innovate UK Business Connect not to point towards current funding opportunities. They're not necessarily always directly relevant to what we're talking about today, but if you want to know more about these opportunities, come and talk to me afterwards, and you can find out more information on our website. I want to leave you with some take-home messages. There is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to invest, but it needs to be now, to help the UK chemical sector transition so that it remains globally competitive. But it is a journey. There really is no single alternative to virgin fossil carbon. And I think we are going to need to be investing in scaling up the 3 different pathways that are available to us here in the UK. We're going to need a more joined up systems approach to managing carbon, thinking about whether it goes into chemicals, fuels, energy. It's actually finite. Where does it make most sense to deploy that carbon? And finally, I think Andrew would be upset if I didn't mention that, of course, we can't lose focus on what happens to chemicals at the end of their life. I've talked a lot about the feedstock angle today, but we mustn't lose focus on what happens at the end of life. Finally, acknowledgements. I'd like to acknowledge David Elson, who's been my collaborator on this project, and also the great consulting team, of which you're going to hear from Jen in a moment as well. But also thank you to you for listening today, but thank you for your input into the study, because I know many of you would have participated. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Pete. That was great, and it saves me some stuff later on, so that's really good. I was interested in the 12 billion pounds for a megaton of ethylene. I don't think that sounds like an awful lot, to be honest. That doesn't sound absolutely outrageous to me. You can make 6 megatons for a price of HS2.
Yeah, and I suppose it depends on what timeline that investment's made and the return on that investment, right? Yeah, well, I'm pleased to hear you. It does sound like a big scary number initially, but you're right, Matt. It's in comparison to the cost of a lot of other things. It's not insurmountable. Yeah, but it's good to start having some numbers that we can use to evaluate, the scale of this transition.
Have you taken into account, my name is Christian from BASF, Germany. Have you taken into account in your investigations also the energy consumption of those future chemicals of the embedded, let's say, circular carbons? Because you have CCU, recycled bio, you mentioned that nobody knows the share, yeah, that's also clear. But think about CCU, yeah, we have 100 megajoule per kilogram of energy what you need. That is a carbon footprint of, let's say, 80 kilograms per kilogram, yeah, just roughly, yeah.
Yeah.
On ethylene or polyethylene, and 2 with fossil. So that gives you just a magnitude of how much energy you need. And in your forecast, we have, let's say, 10-15% CCU. That would be a huge amount of energy what we need. Yeah, and we are already so much as industry under pressure consuming energy, and we are not. Not have a good image, I would say, at certain stakeholders, especially from green parties or from green thinking people. What do you think about this aspect? First, my question was, have you taken into account that? And second is, what if you would take that into account? Where would it end up?
Yeah, I mean, the study didn't go into looking at specifically the energy requirements. As I showed that Sankey diagram of 2050, it didn't look at then marrying up what is the energy requirement of that transition. I think that would be a very useful study to do, by the way. There will be these penalties as we move to diversified feedstocks. And it's really difficult in the world we live in today to see how we're going to meet that energy demand. But I don't know how to square it away. If we're going to move away from virgin fossil, we're still going to have this demand for chemicals. There will be a penalty to pay for energy, and that may come in the form of energy price. But it's going to make sense in different parts of the world to deploy biomass, to deploy carbon dioxide routes or recycling routes. So it's not going to be the same answer for every country. It's going to need to depend on where they have, what is their access to renewable energy, hydrogen, feedstocks. I realise I haven't done a great job of answering your question. It's really complex, but there is absolutely a penalty energy-wise for CO2. But how are we going to meet the demand if the desire is to move away from fossil carbon? How are we going to fill that gap? So I'm hoping someone in the energy sector is going to come. I thought hopefully we're going to solve the energy problem, which is, today the cost of energy is just too high, and it's certainly what I hear from industry in the UK. It's too high in the UK as well to make a lot of chemicals manufacturing industrially competitive. So major challenge. I hope that's a decent waffly answer.
Thank you. Do you have time for maybe 2 questions? Well, there are 2 very questions tonight. Roy, please.
Thanks. Hi, Peter. It's Roy Sandbach. I chaired the Sustainable PLFs Task Force. You said it was great, by the way. I enjoyed it very much.
Thanks.
You said one thing that interested me a lot, and that is that no one owns net zero carbon. Indeed, Anna also said we all need to collaborate. What she didn't say was who should lead that collaboration. So who do you think should own that net zero carbon challenge? That was very, there's a lot of detail, but Who do you think should own that challenge? Are they in this room?
I think we have a major challenge here in the UK chemical industry that there'll be many in the room that remember the days of ICI when we were all joined up and we had one large company that dominated, that had the power and the voice. We no longer have that. We need to recognise that history, but it's no longer there. So we have obviously industry bodies that are speaking up for the sector. In terms of the government piece, we've got DEFRA managing waste. I was going to say waste because we all in this room don't see it as waste, do we? But they're managing waste. We've got Department for Transport looking at the future of aviation fuel and saying they want to use biomass, CO2 and plastic for fuels. You've got DESNES looking at energy. We need a body, I think, sitting over the top that is able to articulate the value of a circular economy, the value of carbon. I do wonder, we've actually got a critical material, this is not official, by the way, this is my personal view. We have a critical material strategy, which is influencing a lot of government decisions around critical materials. I kind of wonder whether carbon needs to be a critical material. It needs to have, because it's not registering at the moment as a critical material.
We've just got time for one final question. That was the hand that's up on the phone before.
Right, to end with a nice simple question. My name's Richard Lampett from the National Oceanography Centre. You referred to available biomass. Lots of people use different interpretations of what that means. What did you mean by that?
Everything, biogenic waste.
Yeah, can I suggest perhaps you save that? Jen's not here, so she's probably like doing this online. I'm going to say divert that to Jen, because she was the key author on the report. She'll be able to tell you exactly how that 24% was derived. Yeah, sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head exactly where that 24% came.
It has the description of technospheric waste and biogenic waste. So she'll talk about that in a minute. But Pete, thank you so much. And thank you who would have thought that